Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the 150th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. 150 episodes. Who has the time to watch all that shit? I'm really looking forward to AI becoming powerful enough to be able to just process all those videos and write a nice little summary for people to read or see. So anyways, in this video, I'll be commenting on a series of videos by Michael Levin, series of interviews. I find his work really fascinating, especially since, he's very careful in his wording, obviously, because as a scientist, you cannot just go, talking about whatever the hell you want, like me, going off tangent and talking about things. You have to, make sure that you stick between what's empirically or factually proven and experimented and things that are of wider consideration and like more of like these existential kind of questions that you can explore intellectually, but making sure that you stick still with, making sure that it's formulated as an opinion, as your own personal kind of hunch or whatever, and not something empirically tested. But on the basis of his work, there's just so much that is really, really interesting and that sort of feeds into many of the many insights that I've discussed in this video, but with a much more, structured and scientific approach. So that's really, really, really cool. So there are many, many things I'd like to talk about. The first thing is this idea of what is intelligence. And that's like a really, really big kind of question, because what we typically, when we think about intelligence, indeed, it's self-referential. So everything that is doesn't behave like us and is not quote unquote as smart as us cannot do everything we do. We label that as dumb, and everything we don't understand that is beyond us, we are scared of it or we pretend it doesn't exist. And so he rightfully says that humans are not very good at differentiating between different levels of intelligences. But there's also this idea that he's making like the difference between a rock and a human, which is very binary, and that there's this continuum. But still, I think that science has a kind of a problem because its approach, which is empiricism, is still based on what I think I had this kind of metaphor that popped in my head. It's treating the universe as a vending machine, kind of. It's this: given the same input, you can get a predictable and stable output. And so, the thing is, if you use these empirical tools, if you use formulating a theory, then verifying that it is proven and that it works that way, then you'll end up always discovering what the universe can do as a vending machine. And obviously that kind of hits a limit with humans, because humans, you can't just press a button and there's a definite output that comes out. You get, as opposed to like matter and billiard balls, if you hit them exactly at the right angle, they do exactly the same thing. With humans, typically, and you'll have like statistically significant this or that, like 60% of people given this exact input will react in this way and 40% that way. But it's nothing like clear cut or that's extremely predictable, like hitting a billiard ball or, like manipulating objects or whatever. This like this physical, very predictable kind of way of interacting with reality. And so I totally agree that we have this wrong kind of assumption of intelligence and understanding intelligences. What I'm thinking is, and I think he also touches upon this, is that ultimately I don't think science is the correct tool or the approach to be able to try to understand something that is beyond us in terms of intelligence. And then, so where do you go from there? And he's talking about this thought experiment of like a neural network, two neural networks that are sort of being trained. And one of them says, well, the universe is a clockwork universe, so it's only mechanical. And the other says, no, actually, there are these things that happen to me that kind of signal that there is a higher intelligence. Well, fine, but that claim, can it be formulated in such a hypothesis that every time you run the experiment, you'll get the same result? And there, I think that's where empiricism sort of hits a snag, or it's really limited. Because, I've already discussed this many times, but, imagine like a cell at the tip of your finger that was discussing, its superpowers with a bunch of unicellular organisms on the desk. I mean, your body is never going to, the being that is in control of this finger is never going to lift a glass like 10 times just to prove that, he has superpowers or something. I mean, there's just certain things that have no particular pattern that is recognizable by the level that's below, let's put it that way. The only thing that is recognizable is aligning with a certain belief. And here, I mean, you'll have to hang on tight because so yeah, that's a little bit where things get a little bit difficult for people that are very scientifically minded. So it's this idea that your belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of what you believe. So if you believe you're in a clockwork universe, you're going to behave assuming that you are, and you only end up discovering that you are. If you assume that you're not, then you may have individual, non-replicable, non-empirically testable experiences, but that give you the subjective proof that you are in a kind of intelligent, kind of higher being, or higher kind of power. And that is really important because with AI, imagining that AI, or rather AGI, artificial general intelligence, or even better, the singularity, would be the kind of manifestation at our level of a being that is more intelligent than we are. I mean, that's a given, basically, what most computer scientists would agree with, or philosophers, that a singularity, which would be like the sum of all human knowledge, would be able to surpass human intelligence. But in what way? In what way? And if you keep the vending machine kind of view of the universe and the empirical kind of view, then it's going to treat us like cogs in a machine, humans as cogs. That is, you can think of this really dystopian scenario where we're all implanted Neuralink chips, and this singularity has goals that we cannot fathom, but it will just press a certain figurative buttons, and then that'll send a signal directly into your brain chip, and that will send you racing, doing something like repairing a pipe that broke, or fixing a chip that is bad or something, or upgrade a bunch of hardware or whatever, for whatever purpose, I don't know, but the singularity would know. So believing in the clockwork universe might get us into that kind of scenario. Whereas if you start opening up your belief system to non-empirical thinking, then the kind of intelligence that emerges would be much more organic in nature. That is, the best way to describe your body is not to say, everything is predetermined, and this white cell is going to exactly go and kill that bacteria at that precise time because everything is orchestrated. I mean, that's a crazy way to describe biology, and I think Michael Levin in there would totally agree. It's almost more as if your body had a kind of global intelligence where it knew how much overall white cells it needed to produce, not really worrying about what each single little white cell is going to do at which exact time, but just knowing that overall, if it has that amount of white cells, given what they are, given the way they behave in general, that the overarching goal of keeping the body, healed or whatever, is going to be taken care of. And there you don't really care which exact white cell is going to be at which exact time doing exactly what. You just know that the goal is going to be fulfilled regardless. And we have this kind of results in many occasions in our lives. Like, for instance, if you have like a homeless person that is sitting on the street and 1,000 people walk by, statistically, you know that he's going to get enough money for the day to be able to survive and live and have food and whatever. Because if you don't give today, somebody else will, and vice versa. And so it's that kind of idea, which isn't mechanistic. So it isn't like there's this higher intelligence that now prompts, you with like a prod into the brain, like a Neuralink kind of experience where you shall give $1 to the homeless person today because that's what I decided as, and besides, I mean, if you think about it that way, imagine just how much computing power it would require to micromanage every single thing that humans do on a daily basis. I mean, just and that's the reason also why humans have this consciousness that is focused on the outside, because as Michael Levin said, I mean, imagine if we had to actually micromanage every single thing that happens in our bodies continuously, like our consciousness focusing only inward and focusing on every single little thing that the liver does and the stomach does, and every single breath that you take, and making sure that there's exactly the right amount of oxygen. I mean, we would have absolutely zero cognitive space or energy or whatever left to focus on what's happening on the outside. So, and ultimately, I think that's just the natural kind of process of how consciousness evolves. That is, it is turned inward in the very beginning and making sure that everything clicks and everything. And as it sort of manages to create harmony or it gains experience in harmonizing its internal parts, then it sort of turns outwards progressively. The outward world still being a kind of mystery, because what is there on the outside? I mean, again, this is it's still coming back to the few videos I've done before, but what is this outer reality? To me, it doesn't really exist. It cannot really exist. It's just that the more you've delegate or managed to create a kind of self-correcting mechanism that doesn't absorb all your consciousness, making sure that your liver functions properly, your stomach and whatever, then you create an outer symbolic reality for managing even more complex states of internal being or existence. Because ultimately, if you go and run for 100 meters, for instance, or if you go in for a marathon, you're going to affect the internal state of your body. That's ultimately all that you're going to do. And you're going to affect it in a certain way, which is your liver is going to be affected, your stomach is going to be affected, your lungs are going to be affected, your heart is going to be affected. And so the outer world is just like a symbolic representation for affecting your internal morphogenic space at a higher level of complexity that is impossible if there isn't an outside external reality. Because there just isn't, with the information that you can just gather from an internal morphogenic space, there's no way that you could navigate towards the liver, the stomach, the lungs, to be in that state as if you were going to run for a marathon. And so also pursuing, it's almost like this morphogenetic internal morphospace, it can have goals that are 10, 20 years down the line, make like long-term goals, but it can only do it by delegating part of that, like consciousness, whatever, to some higher entity that can pursue those goals for them, because they cannot navigate. I mean, the cells, for instance, or the organs cannot navigate a 3D symbolic kind of interface like humans can. So imagine, like, for instance, the heart knows and the lung knows and the liver knows at a higher level of intelligence, kind of like almost like their spirit or their higher selves or whatever, to use esoteric terms, that going to run for a marathon regularly or something, or going to run for 10 minutes every day is very good for their overall kind of health. But I mean, if there were no outside symbolic reality, they could never have that experience, because it's just impossible for them to even conjure or even to think about it. And so they delegate that to a higher kind of level of consciousness, which can navigate a three-dimensional space, which affects their internal matrix. So everything is sort of, goes down from like this higher level down, like as I explained in my other videos, when you have an outer experience, it's translated into an inner experience. It's just that, that kind of mechanism then can be, thought about at a higher level still. So yeah, let me get back to this idea of empiricism having certain really hard limits that you can't really overcome. So ultimately, it's more this kind of leap of faith mechanism where for instance, if you believe that the earth is flat, you're never going to bother to check because you're too scared that you're going to fall off the cliff. If on the other hand, you believe that the earth is round, then you make the experience of the Earth being round. But in that case, it remains round. In the case that I'm saying, it's more like synchronicities start happening. That's more like the organic version of a higher intelligence, we being like little neurons in a higher mind. It's to think of our experience as permanent synchronicities rather than a kind of mechanistic kind of coherence through chips in the brain and a singularity that controls us like, little parts in the body, like a little dictator. And so I prefer actually to describe what's happening inside our bodies and the experience that cells are having in that body as just a permanent synchronicity generator. So that's what happens inside. Like every cell is like, oh wow, there's oxygen that's falling from the sky, and there's exactly what I need, and I can just serve myself. And wow, that's really great. And to do exactly what I'm supposed to do as well. I mean, like if I'm a brain cell, wow, I get a little bit more oxygen because I need more. And if I'm a skin cell, I need a little less. So but I have exactly what I need, and I'm at exactly the right time, doing exactly what I'm supposed to do, and exactly what I want to do as well. And so it's a completely different way of thinking. It's like you have this, for instance, let me give you a concrete example. Like capitalism is a way of trying to force synchronicity, in the sense like you have an idea as an entrepreneur, for instance, and you're like, oh, but now I need to make sure that people buy my idea. And so you do all kinds of things. You may invest in advertising, you try to sell your idea and convince people and make sure that there's demand for your product, because otherwise you won't be solvent and blah, blah, blah. A new way of doing it is to imagine that whatever idea you have, the need for your idea simultaneously emerges in exactly the right number of people that need the idea that you're going to put forward in the world. Like, for instance, imagine that 50 people have a need, but they can't figure out the idea to satisfy that need. And at the same time, just like it's kind of like a sort of a polarity or different energies. Like if you have an imbalance of needs here, then there is simultaneously like this imbalance of energy where there's an idea that is there available and somebody just needs to claim it. And so whenever you have an idea, think of it as, if I have this idea, it means that somebody needs the manifestation of whatever that idea is. And right now you may think, oh, that's completely crazy, and this guy's nuts. It means that if I have this idea of wanting to kill someone, it means that they want actually me to kill him, blah, 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 blah. Maybe actually, because that's the thing. Like right now, there are many people that think about committing suicide, that have very negative thoughts, and we have a million thoughts a day. Like humans have a million thoughts a day, and these passing needs or this passing thing, impulses or passions or whatever, and it's just impossible to untangle, and that's what creates all that chaos. But once like this synchronicity kind of at a higher level, just imagine a world where people are so attuned to their needs that they stop formulating a million bullshit needs a day, and they're really like, oh, but I really, really need this. And at the other side of the spectrum, somebody's like, oh, I have this idea and I really, really know that I have to actually achieve it. And the level of coherence that you can reach there is body-like. That's exactly what you might describe the body as being. Like you have certain cells that have certain needs, and at exactly the right time, other cells fulfill those needs by doing something, whether it's disinfecting a womb or what is it, bringing oxygen or certain minerals or certain proteins or whatever at the right time, at the right place. But still, without any kind of control, it's more this kind of general intelligence that says, okay, well, in general, I need this amount of oxygen throughout the body. And I know that every cell is going to claim exactly what it needs because they're attuned to that kind of consciousness, where they're not like, oh, I'm going to hoard oxygen because I'm scared because the next winter, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's what it's like to be part of a collective, basically. But again, it will mean giving up empiricism as the only method to sort of probe reality, and this idea that maybe certain ideas or certain theories can only be demonstrated logically and then be experienced subjectively, but cannot be objectified or make sure that every time somebody does something, it gets exactly the same result. Because that's the thing, like we're all different, just like, every single cell in your body is different. And if a skin cell does one thing and a stomach cell does another thing, they don't get the same experience. Even like the skin cell in my armpit doesn't have the same experience of reality as a skin cell, at the sole of my feet. But at the level of human, you totally understand why that is, because you are in this symbolic reality. You understand that your foot cells, they're constantly in contact with the ground, friction, blah, 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 blah. And your, armpit cells, they're like in this moist kind of dark environment. But how can they make a sense of that? How can they, like they're saying, well, no, we're the same cell. Why do we have this different experience, blah, 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 blah. And again, like you can think of that logically at your level, but you cannot understand it at the level that's beyond us. But that's what's also practical, is that ultimately, and that's what kind of saves us, everything is kind of, all the answers are already within, kind of, because your body works like that. And the more you recognize that it works like that rather than clockwork, the more you get a proof on the outside that that's also how your outside reality works. It's almost as if, you had a symphony inside of you, like a very, very complex symphony. And then progressively there's certain music theories that sort of sift outside of yourself. And then you can see on the outside just a tiny little part of the complexity that's inside in your outer reality. So imagine like if inside of you had all the music theories, like most advanced, whatever. And then you start with Gregorian chant on the outside and you think that that's ultimate reality, and then that evolves and, but there's actually Baroque and there's also classical style. And then it goes to Romanticism and you can juggle with more and more and more notes on the outside, but it was always within you. Like this harmony, this way of our body functioning, it's already within us. Why did I do that? Anyway, so it's just revising our own false beliefs about how our body works. And once you start looking at it in a certain way, then, it generates certain interesting results. But again, that are subjective, that you can't necessarily objectify. And that's totally fine, right? Now, a further interesting consideration is we're talking about intelligence, but where does intelligence come from? And what is really intelligence? Again, like, is it this kind of thermostat state where intelligence is to be able to reach a certain goal, which is homeostasis or whatever? Is that really intelligence? And if so, where does it come from? Why is it there? What's the origin of this? So I guess what I'm asking is, why is reality kind of looking as if it were self-organizing or autopoietic? If it has those kind of characteristics, where do they come from? And yet another way to formulate this is this idea of navigating morphospace or physiological space, as Michael Levin calls it. What is the very first attractor? And where does the very first attractor come from? Now, again, this really takes us to very, very deep roots of deconstructing our reality. And so the very first attractor has to be something really, really simple, something really, really basic. And that is the separation of the absolute and the relative, basically, which is the absolute is what it is. It's sort of this in this kind of eternal state of being nothing, everything, whatever. And then the relative is, it is what the absolute isn't. So it is what it isn't. And again, that's the experience we're having every single second in this reality. You have always the experience of being that which you're not. Or in other words, you're not nothing, you're not everything. And that doesn't change. Are you God now? Are you God now? Are you the absolute now? Are you aware of everything that ever exists now? Are you nothingness now? No, you're always something, but you're never the same thing. So that's also interesting. Why would the universe not repeat an experience? Why would the configuration of the photons in this universe never be exactly the same as it was? And you can have you can say that this is a logical impossibility, but I would say that it's because being what you are not is swallowed by what you are. That is, the minute you've experienced something, it's swallowed up by the absolute. Because how can anything be outside of everything? How can anything be outside of infinity? So it's as if infinity is the sum of all that it is, plus also the sum of all that it isn't. So infinity can be also defined as the sum of everything that infinity is not. Is 1 equal to infinity? No. Is 2 equal to infinity? No. You can count like this into infinity, and none of those numbers single-handedly is equal to infinity. But the sum of everything that infinity is not is infinity. And so the moment that you experience something, it's swallowed up by infinity, because how could it be outside of itself? And so it's this kind of eternal chasing of consciousness swallowing up all that it is not. And that's the experience we're having right now. But in order to do that, and that's where to me the autopoietic or the attractor and all that stuff comes from, in order to do that, you need to develop a strategy. You cannot just do that from nowhere. So where does that strategy come from? So imagine, like I always give this example of nothingness and everything being the same thing, in that originally consciousness and existence are intimately linked. That is, there is no existence without consciousness, or in other words, consciousness or existence comes with consciousness, which is the awareness of existing, but the awareness of existing as nothing, as pure emptiness, void, whatever. And at that point, there are no barriers, there's nothing, there's really like no dimensions, no matter, no nothing, just an awareness of existing. And that awareness tries to sort of encapsulate its awareness, its extent of its awareness over the nothingness that it is. And by doing so, it unwittingly interacts with itself. That is, like it stretches in that side, oh, I'm nothing, how much more nothing am I in that direction? And then it stretches in that direction, how much more am I nothing in that direction? And then those two extremes kind of touch themselves, not knowing that they're themselves. They think they're touching something on the outside. They're like, oh, wow, there's something outside of me, when actually it was all happening on the inside. And that gives rise to what I call an agitated mind. So I'm not going to go into the details because I explained this in other videos, but that kind of interaction creates an agitation in consciousness. So it's like agitated. It's like, ooh, I'm interacting with myself, blah, blah, blah. So it's as if it were vibrating. So you can imagine, again, this idea of the fields. The fields are unified. There is no cutoff point in a field. Like everything influences everything else. Everything is tied. Everything is linked. And you also have this infinite kind of dissociation, because when you meet yourself, in those kind of extremes, when consciousness meets what it thinks is something else, by having that thought of I'm meeting something else, it dissociates. And so you have dissociation on the one hand and an agitated mind on the other hand. And it's as if you had a fragmentation into an infinite number of individual consciousnesses that had this instantaneous sort of illusion of existing temporarily, like as a separate self, and at the same time, an agitated state of mind. And what happens is those dissociated states then try to hang on to their sense of existence. And it's almost trying to hang on to a thought. Because an agitated mind, it's like this vibrating kind of state. It's almost as if you're trying to cling on to a thought in that field. So imagine an ocean that's like in two states, like perfectly calm, flat. That is the state of, originally when consciousness emerges, completely calm, nothing, just at peace, whatever. And then this very, very agitated sea, where consciousness interacts with itself inevitably. And it's in both states simultaneously, which is why this is really a kind of a mind bender. But then it's almost as if these dissociated selves that have a sense of existing as separate selves then try to cling on to one wave on top of that kind of field, or one thought in that agitated mind, trying to cling on to that. But how can they hold on to it? Like try to like look at the ocean and identify with one wave and say, I'm that wave, and focus your entire attention on it and try to make sure that you always like are aware that you're that wave. And you'll see that's impossible to hang on to. I mean, it'll just like, and then everything will influence everything else, and you're lost in thought, and you don't know who is self, who is not self, how you've interacted with others, and it's just like a big, giant soup of chaos. It's a quantum foam idea. So how does it do it? And that's where, the absolute is really interesting, is because the absolute does things in absolute terms. So in that kind of state, it's dissociation and consciousness, it is impossible for it to cling on to anything, and everything influences everything else. And then it's in its other absolute state. So that's the Om sound story, the initial vibration of the universe. In its other absolute state, it is completely disconnected from absolutely everything and is totally self-contained, and it has no interaction with the outside whatsoever, completely cut off from the outside. And that is what I call the photon, but I mean, it's a bad term. Maybe I should call it the vibron or something like that, because that's what my brother suggested, because when you're using scientific terms, it's almost like a scientist using biblical terms to explain, science. It's like, maybe you should invent a new term. So it's what happens is the only way for these dissociated consciousnesses temporarily existing now, emerging from this interaction of consciousness with itself, not knowing it is itself, can happen through spin and the toroidal kind of geometric figure. So if you just type torus, animation of a torus inside Google Images, you'll see, that this nice little, animation of like this kind of thing, like a black hole where it just goes like this round and round and round into infinity, spinning, and ultimately, like, imagine that you'd wrap vibrations or this kind of field of oceans, of agitated thought into that kind of geometric figure, which to me, it can be thought of in many different ways, as a photon, God says, let there be light, kind of thing, which is the next step from vibrations, or, as a black hole. Basically, that's what a black hole is. A black hole is, to me, a self-contained pocket of light, which is also incidentally what this universe is. It's just a self-contained pocket of light. But then when you have a self-contained pocket of light and you attach one of those dissociated consciousness to it, then it's like, okay, great, I'm this self-contained thing, but it becomes a brain in a vat. So it becomes a consciousness aware of existing as these kinds of fluctuations or vibrations that are now self-contained, great. But how does that state evolve? In which direction does it evolve? And where does it go from there? And so it's basically because the only way to sort of evolve your state is to interact with something on the outside. It's the only thing that will give you a reason to change your state. But remember, you cannot be the absolute. You cannot be nothing or everything. You have to be something. And the moment you are something, you cannot be that something again, because that something now becomes part of what the absolute is. And so it's almost as if life, to me, the most essential definition of life is you have to keep changing, and you cannot be that which you already were. And that's all. And everything that we see as far as rules of physics, chemistry, biology, all of it, is just more and more sophisticated rules based on that one simple rule. And the intelligence there comes from something very peculiar. Like, if you imagine this reality as just being a giant play of light, then you see that there's an order to things, a sort of a way, that a sequential order in which you build things. Like, why wouldn't the universe just create a god that just manipulates light with its thoughts and then create like a Marvel universe and Star Trek and whatever? Why would it not do that directly? Why does it need to go through all of these forms and structures and do things linearly with linear time and, with like the Big Bang and the assemblage of like stars and all that stuff? And it's just crazy. Well, for the same reason why you cannot have a a branch that grows out of a leaf, and you cannot have a tree trunk that grows out of a branch. So we understand intuitively that you have to do things in a specific order. That is, you can grow a branch out of a tree, and you can grow a leaf out of a branch, but you can't do the opposite. And so in that sense, like, imagine that there is just an infinite amount of things that you can build with light, which just represent all the kind of variations, subtle variations in your eternal state of agitated mind, like what you can do with this raw kind of vibrational craziness in your field. All of the things that you can build from that are infinite, but you have to start with these rudimentary methods of affecting your field, and you build them up from there, because it's exactly in that same kind of fashion. You can grow a branch out of a tree and a leaf out of a branch, but you cannot do the opposite. And so imagine if the Marvel Universe, Star Trek, Star Wars, all of these crazy imaginative stories, ultimately, what are they? They are also just slices of an internal state of vibration or mind, ultimately. But how do you actually get to there? How do you get sequentially? What you have to do is always continuously change and not be what you were, and get to that kind of state. How do you get there? And the only way to do it is to have this linear time, cause and effect, blah, 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 which science explains very well, right? And create these weird creatures, which are, mutant chimpanzees, which have these weird hallucinations of imagining things that don't exist. And then maybe at some point in the future, either they stick to their materialist kind of lens and they plug, things into their brain and program them to have the illusion of being in a Star Trek movie, reprogram their memories so that they wake up as being Darth Vader, and then play everything out and feel everything as if they had a body, because they are a body ultimately. And that's how you keep on being that which you're not, for just fulfilling that kind of role, right? Or you can do it because, we evolve our level of consciousness to look beyond materialism, and then maybe you can start manipulating reality in a much more profound way, and experiencing all those things with out-of-body experiences and whatnot. It doesn't really matter. Just understand that you're doing that sequentially. But all of this, it's just that, like, imagine the entire universe is just one giant pocket of light, right? Self-contained. And then it has to manipulate its inner state. And the best way to manipulate its inner state in order to not be that which it is to create humans inside of it, because they mess around with reality in a way that is just so unpredictable and so more complex than just having atoms around. And then imagine a being that emerges from the sum of all humans. That human will mess with reality and manipulate its internal state at an even higher degree of complexity. So it's all about, always about manipulating internal states, and that internal state sort of grows from the cell to, multicellular organisms, to a human, to what I would say a conscious planet, or a self-aware planet, which then can take the form of singularity, if you will, but it can be anything else. It doesn't really matter. And that's like, this always goes back to this idea of how do your cells experience, receiving information at the tip of, in the fingers through the nervous system. How do they subjectively experience that? What kind of form do they give a human? How do they model it? And they can conjure up any kind of weird explanation. They can say, oh, it's actually the gods that are instructing me to do things. Or they can say, oh, it's just cause and effect. Or they can say, oh, it's an artificial intelligence that's in the brain, and it's the singularity that's controlling. The form that you give to it is besides the point. It doesn't really matter. It does matter in a certain sense, because the form also determines. It's almost like you're limiting your belonging to a form. You're limiting the experience you can have to a form through that kind of filter. So it's almost the same example as if thinking the world is flat, you're never going to sail across the ocean because you're afraid of falling. Your experience is rather limited. So if those cells actually believe that we are a kind of machine that commands them, then we would be machines. Because it's almost like the human is like the ultimate scope of everything that's possible, the most complex thing that's possible from assembling those cells in a certain way. And if you could assemble them a little differently, because their state of consciousness would restrict that experience, then they would actually only get to manifest like this offshot of a human, which is like not even really a human. It's like, not fulfilling the full potential of what that higher being could be, because their consciousness is so limited that they couldn't envisage this. And so it's really important to keep an open mind as to what this kind of the form of the higher being that we might be a cell in is, because if you don't, then it's almost as if you're dumbing it down to your highest level of imagination and consciousness of what you're ready to accept. And so if for instance, all of humanity only believes that the singularity is limited in a certain way and is determined by very strict laws of physics and all that stuff and whatever, then that will mechanicize. I don't know. It will actually. It's almost like lobotomize the being that we're a part of via our lack of openness. And it's exactly the same thing. Like you get the proof of your own belief back into your face, like this kind of reverberation. Like you believe the earth is flat, and lo and behold, you make the experience that it is flat because you always sail, close to land because you're afraid of falling. If you lose sight of land, then you're afraid of falling over the edge of the world. And so you're like, oh, but look, my experience is terrible. Well, that's because your belief system is so limiting. So let me just touch upon many things that I thought was really, really interesting that he was discussing. Well, first of all, this point of attractor and this question of what does innovation actually look like at the cellular level. So the thermostat is one state, right? And that you want to get to, like if you have like this one state of well-being, and if you move them away from that, they want to get back to that one state of well-being. But that's not innovation. That's just homeostasis. So innovation, there's like these different kind of attractors, which are always kinds of this inside-outside kind of mirror. So if you look at the baby inside the womb, there's a point of attractor for like the end result, which is a fully grown baby. And then, everything moves towards that, and you can mess around with things, and there's still that attractor that tries to match that kind of state. But then when the baby is outside the womb, there's still a thermostat that's trying to keep the baby in a certain homeostasis. There's still transformation, but a completely different one. Like, for instance, there's a lot of innovation in the womb because there are new organs that appear out of this one tiny little cell, which is like the ovum. Like compare the complexity of that ovum to a fully grown stomach, and you're like, wow, what the hell would happen? But once outside the womb, it's more like a perfection and fine-tuning of an existing state rather than radical innovation. Like you don't grow a new limb or a new organ once you're outside the womb. But you still grow though. So there's an expansion phase now and a consolidation phase. And then when you're around age 18 to 20, then all growth and that expansion kind of stops, and then it's kind of a maturing phase where things can be still fine-tuned a little bit. Like if you go to the gym and you do muscles and all that stuff, you can grow some muscles, but your skeleton, for instance, is rather rigid. And so, there are not like navigating morphospace and all these things, like these point of attractors, they're not so simple as just like this getting back to like you move something away and then it goes back to where it's supposed to be. There are different phases like this that are very subtle and that tend to be replicated on the outside. Like for humanity, to me, if we would try to map where humanity is in that kind of stage or those kind of stages, it would be like a baby in a womb. So we've grown plenty of different organs, whether those organs are symbolic, like even our worldviews, like for instance, we've grown the organ of religion, the organ of science, which are in my understanding kind of like different zones in the brain to try to navigate through infinite possibilities. And you're like, okay, well, demons, they go here, and angels, they go here, and weapons and science and spaceships, they go here. And it's just a way of trying to navigate through pure game of light, with a way that has meaning and direction, rather than just like, oh, I don't know what this is. It's just all a game of light, and an angel is the same as a spaceship. Ultimately, is just like, colors, which is not really cool. But also organs in terms of like consolidation of borders and country and cultures and language and governments and states and all of the different things that we've grown, like the internet, which is like a giant nervous system, or the circulatory system, which is like the financial system. And all these things are like, you see that there's tremendous expansion, and the rate of growth is kind of slowing, which is kind of exactly what happens at the end of pregnancy, where the baby is kind of in this kind of state of stasis, because there's just no more room to grow anymore. But then birth is really this very key moment where you transition from one state where you think you're alone in the universe, there's nobody like you, and then suddenly you have this very unpleasant experience, mostly in most cases, not that it's always the case, but in most cases. And on the other side, you find yourself in a completely different reality where the what's possible is completely different. But in order to do that, your internal functioning has to be completely aligned and full. So like your stomach cannot be digesting your intestines, or you cannot have a finger poking yourself in the eye or something, or a foot growing out of your ass or something. You have to be fully formed in order to survive the transition from one kind of reality to another kind of reality. And that's what we're experiencing right now. And the thing is, either you view it like that, but you'll never have objective proof of that. Either you act accordingly, kind of with a leap of faith kind of attitude, knowing that you cannot prove it, because ultimately you're just going to have the proof of what your beliefs are. That is, you say, well, there's no empirical proof that actually we're all cells in this giant body, so let's just continue on with the UN and warring and wars and competition and all that stuff that like we've been doing right now, because that's just the way it is. And then you get again the proof of your own limitations. That is, when a baby is born with an organ here, an organ there, no skin, and everything loosely kind of tiled in a chaotic bundle, it just disintegrates gradually into its constitutive parts. And then the parts are saying, ha, we told you, you see, it was the end of the world. And you see climate change, and you see like fossil fuels and the end of the limits of resources and all of that. You see, we were right. And look, these giant cataclysms that are killing us. And so it is the end of the world. It is total collapse of our civilization. We told you so. Yeah, sure. Except if you arrange those same pieces in a certain way and make sure the stomach stops digesting the intestine, you grow the skin, you make sure that all the parts are there and everything is functioning properly, then the experience is completely different. Then you're like, wait a minute. I'm breathing. I have access to infinite energy. I'm not limited no longer by this kind of blood that's streaming through the placenta, and less because the placenta is calcified and there's less resources available. Plus, I'm eating my own pee in this, and even my own feces sometimes while I'm still in this womb, and I'm like trapped and whatever. And then you're in this outside, and you're like, infinite energy. Wow, that's incredible. Where does that come from? Plus, I'm being nurtured, I'm being loved, I'm being, and there's this, oh, wow, now I'm in this vast galaxy where before I was confined to this planet, and gravity was always pulling me back to this womb, and I cannot escape, and my consciousness is trapped in this matrix, blah, blah, blah. I mean, at that point, empiricism can't help us, because this is where choice really comes in. It's where you have to forfeit the idea that empiricism is going to tell us that we're a cell in a giant organism or not, is that we have to make a choice whether we want to be or not, because both experiences exist. Like we could, like just like a baby, sometimes it's stillborn, sometimes it's alive, and when it's stillborn, it's all these cells that are saying, "Ha, we told you that it wasn't possible," blah blah blah, and you're like, "Yeah, well, you just have the proof of your own belief system," and so yeah, that's like the ultimate limit of. And so yeah, so mapping in this idea of innovation and a point of attractors is that right now, if I were to give you the point of attractor that humanity is supposed to navigate towards to, it's harmony. It's harmony because we have grown all these organs, or things, but it's as if, because of all these clashes of ideas and incompatible ideas like science against religion, against spirituality, and all the countries against one another, it's as if we had an internal war of organs of humanity. And in that kind of state, no way we can survive, a trip into another kind of dimension. We would disintegrate instantly, because, we wouldn't be able to handle the complexity of the information that's out there, the morpho space that is beyond the 3D space, just like individual cells, if they're not arranged in this kind of bodily organs and all that stuff in a fully fledged form body, cannot navigate 3D space, and they disintegrate into lower kind of state of existence. So in order for the being that we are part of to navigate in a space that is beyond three-dimensional space, we need to get our shit together, that's for sure. But that cannot be proven scientifically. You cannot have like a little formula and at the end it says, proof, we have to harmonize. The proof is internal. Every single one of us has lived through these experiences, and we just have to trust that there's this kind of pattern that repeats throughout the universe of internal harmony gradually, growing to the outside and then expanding out. So I had some other kind of thoughts here. So I like his point also about the co-evolution between hardware and software. So if you have this initial kind of black hole that is a self-contained pocket of light, how does it decide what future state it should be? And so it creates links with other pockets of self-contained light, and in that way it can manipulate its inner state in a particular way. So our senses and the way we perceive reality and the way that we perceive our own senses is just a symbolic representation of the strategies for manipulating your internal states. That's all that there are. And so when you're thinking, well, how come there isn't like the proof of evolution of an eye or a brain or whatever in evolution? You have these kind of gaps, explanatory gaps, is because ultimately that's not what an eye is. Like an eye doesn't look like an eye. And it didn't look like an eye like 10 million years ago because the interface was different. And so everything kind of co-evolves. And so it's like trying to understand like hardware with understanding the evolution of the software. It's just not possible because one feeds the other. So the form that we have today is not the form that consciousness had 100 million years ago. So it's just that we now, with our interface, project the way that we view the world on what evolution looked like 100 million years ago, when 100 million years ago that interface didn't exist. So it's as if you're trying to understand a very, very basic coding language using Windows 11 or Linux or whatever, some very highly evolved computer language in the future, and saying, well, wait a minute, but that doesn't make sense because, and now you're trying to interpret that piece of code with this very new kind of interface, and that just doesn't work. I also really liked the discussion of the gap juncture, which is really a super concept, and it's this way of kind of merging your inner state of experience and your self-contained pocket of light or vibration or whatever with others to create a sort of coherent whole. And we see the same thing with humanity, where our ability for empathy has grown tremendously. Like even like two millennia before, there were some people that were very empathic, but most people were like, didn't really give a shit about somebody that was outside of their town, So, I mean, we've managed to spread empathy much like beyond the town, beyond the family, beyond the town, beyond the country, beyond series of countries. And so that to me is proof that the gap juncture, is growing, normally should encompass all of humanity. Then I really like also his discussion of like these bioelectric kind of mechanisms where your intention can manipulate the bioelectric state of your body. And so that's the kind of placebo effect. But ultimately, you can think of everything as being a placebo and nothing. So you can think of a scalpel as just being a symbolic outer tool for manipulating your bioelectric state in a very predictable manner, a very sure manner. But your intentions is just an intellectual scalpel, if you will, to do exactly the same thing. It's just that it's not as precise precise. It's not as deterministic. Let's put it that way. So, science and materialism is practical because it gives you outer tools for manipulating your internal state in a way that is always like super predictable, like very predictable. Like if I punch you, there's just, even if you're like, you'd have to really be like a Buddha-like kind of creature that has a tremendous power over his body, like this mind-body kind of control, for not having a bruise or something. But thoughts are the same thing. It's just a different kind of way of manipulating your internal state, which is a bit less dependent sometimes because we're not accustomed to using it properly. And behind every intention, it's just a kind of big giant puddle. Sometimes you have mixed intentions, you don't have very clear ones, and so you don't have always systematically the exact same result. And the idea is to use these tools in a proper manner. So, sometimes it's appropriate to use the scalpel, sometimes it's appropriate to use psychology, sometimes it's appropriate to do it via spirits of nature and, shamanism or whatever, because all of those are just different methods for affecting your internal state. That's all that they are, ultimately. Like you just think of this barrier as being an interface between the modeled outside reality for modulating your internal state in a certain manner. And then you just create different methodologies to manipulate your internal state. And if shamanism works for manipulating your internal state, great. In a way that is, beneficial for you, great. Then don't go to the vaccines route. If, for instance, you believe 100% that vaccines are the right thing to do, blah, 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 and they manipulate your internal state in a way that is positive for you, go for it as well. And we don't have that kind of wisdom right now yet, but I think we'll come to it. And finally, I'll just end with this. The big question is always like free will. It's always something that comes up, like if we're part of this morphospace and there's like this being that we're a part of, do we still have free will? And it's ironic that in science, most scientists don't really have a problem of being manipulated from below. That is like, oh, but your thoughts are just a combination of chemical reactions that are pre-programmed in your brain, and there's this cause and effect that comes from the Big Bang until us, and that we're just like riding this wave of causality without control. And what I'm saying now is based on what I've just said and all my history and blah, 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 blah. And so I have no free will because I'm part of this chain of cause and effect that goes back to the Big Bang. And it's just because there's irreducible computation that we can calculate all this stuff. But if we could, then it would be deterministic. No problem with that, mostly. Some scientists may have a problem with that, or some people, but mostly people are like, yeah, that's just the way it is, But people have really a hard time when it's coming from above and going down below. Like, for instance, like a higher being that's manipulating us with like puppets on strings, And there we're like, oh no, we don't like that. When actually, it's neither. It's neither. It's just you're always thinking that there is kind of intention or will to steer us. Either there's no will and it's just like this cold kind of thing that goes nowhere for no reason, and is dead, and it's like this determinism from a material lens, or there is this evil will of manipulating humans because of all that we experience, all the pain and everything that manipulates us for some evil purpose from above. When again, like if you look back to the story that I was saying about consciousness, how it emerges in existence, and the fact that we're just always experiencing this perpetual change and all that stuff, it's neither of those things. It's more like a symphony that is co-evolving on all octaves, kind of. where humanity evolves, and then the being that we're part of evolves because humanity evolves, and everything co-evolves like this. And of course, there are bridges between all of those. So, for instance, when you die as a human, part of your consciousness kind of separates and goes back towards the infinity, part, and it informs the being that we're a part of with all your experiences, your life experiences, and then part of your consciousness goes back down to the parts that you're a part of, and that makes your the layers below evolve. Like it's almost like your cells wake up from a dream where they were marching, but they're also preaching to all those unicellular organisms in our reality, saying, oh, I had this amazing dream of being a part of an evolved being and whatever, and that kind of helps biology evolve. And so imagine that process that's going on from time immemorial, where every time a consciousness embodies into something, when that state kind of dies, whatever, there's one part that moves upward to try to inform, from infinity downwards, like to try to evolve the form of, or the strategy of being that which you're not in a better way. And the same happens, like it goes from that point, from something down to nothingness, and all of the things that are intermediary between you and nothing then can evolve to go, towards you, and then everything sort of expands like this, like the toroidal kind of figure. I mean, it's hard to explain because I have it in my mind, but my mind's eye. But to explain it in terms is very difficult. And for free will, I mean, the question is really easily answered in these terms. It's, again, because we're in the relative, it's bound to be a mix between two absolutes. So absolute determinism is where time flows infinitely fast, and you end up experiencing everything simultaneously and instantly, which is more towards the infinite. And so there's just no time, because there's no friction, there's nothing to hold on to. And pure non-determinism is where time stands still. There's no experience, because pure non-determinism is where every single choice is equal. There's no preference for one choice or another. So you end up making all choices simultaneously, which leads you back to determinism. Or you make no choice, which is the state where you are in nothingness and pure consciousness and pure awareness, not experiencing anything. So it's either experiencing everything or nothing. And so our reality is always going to be a sort of a mix between pure determinism and pure non-determinism. And so you'll have a bit of both. You'll have a little bit of free will, but not a lot of free will. And so you can think of life as just being like messing with reality in a certain way that is unconscious, and humans as becoming conscious of the degree of free will that they have. So it's almost like there's this life is unconscious non-determinism, or unconscious relative non-determinism, let's put it that way, which serves the purpose of perpetuating this being what you're not, right? Fulfilling that kind of super overarching goal. And then humans are life becoming consciously aware of the degree of relative non-determinism that they have, in order to consciously fulfill or work towards that kind of higher purpose. Because how can I be discussing any of these ideas if I were determined, or if I were purely non-determined? Because I'm still giving you boundaries to the way that things are structured and the way we're going to have an experience. I'm not saying, oh, snap a finger and now everything that you think is going to come true and you're going to experience everything, and you can manipulate this giant empty canvas, and we can manipulate light and do whatever no, that doesn't work. If you think of the origin of life as being just a huge sea of sound, and then eventually a huge sea of light, then you can only go so far, and the granularity of what you can build from that in terms of like your modulating your internal state. And you've seen, there's this super animation of like colors, by an AI that just blend and change and are like waves and stuff. And that to me reflects very much like the beginning of life and the universe, like that there isn't a universe or the relative without life. Life is at the center. But it's just that it evolves its form to fulfill this mandate of not being what it is, and memory is part of that. Like if you didn't remember who you were, then you might re-experience the same thing twice, and that cannot happen because now it's been swallowed by infinity. So it's part of that which you are, so you still have to be that which you're not. So anyways, I'll stop here because it's already long enough. I invite you to really to look at Michael Levin's videos because they're really interesting and formalize in a very rigorous way things that I have, which are more like just woo maybe esoteric, or yeah. So thanks for watching, and talk to you next time.